first of all, there was tremendous excitement in the village. You go back now, there was crisis after crisis. And it all started to begin to buzz, really. We began round about the time of the Spanish Civil War. This is when it all began, in the mid-30s. In a school, I was in school in Oystermouth, and whilst we were there, you know, it was all beginning to buzz. And then the Macquaries came to Mumbles and opened up Forte's ice cream parlour. Now, these were Italians, and they were delightful lads, and they integrated straight away. They were very popular in view of the sort of infinite source of ice cream if you were friends, you see. And then came the invasion by Italy of Abyssinia. And as you know, we've got a connection in Swansea with Haile Selassie, in that he left Abyssinia and he brought his children to Swansea, and he was eternally grateful for being housed in the Bible College. Now, at that time, again now, there was a tremendous amount of hatred against the fascists and all this business. We didn't really know what the hell it was all about. But sadly, people's venom turned against the Italian population. But it made no difference to the boys here at all, inasmuch that we liked Elio and Olimpio Macari. And his old man was a bit of a stiff neck. He could hardly speak English. And he was a bit severe, but he was a good man at heart. And they had a lot of stick, but it made no difference. And now Elio and Olimpia Macari never, ever forgot that. All their lives, they remembered the boys who were friends. And I remember coming down from London many, many years later and sitting in the ice cream parlour with my wife from London, and she hadn't met these boys, and he dropped everything and he came over, this huge man, and sat down and put his arms around me, and he said, "I'll never forget you." And he was like that with everybody. And sadly again, the old man was interned during the war. When the big war came, you know, in 1939, he was put away, and we didn't see him again till after the war. I don't know what happened to the two boys during that period, because I was away myself, but I digress. Really speaking, the Spanish Civil War, and then the invasion of Abyssinia, and then there were all the various crises where Chamberlain went to Munich, you know, and he came back with that little piece of paper, Peace in Our Time, and then finally, then I think the biggest impact really was one Saturday evening on September the 2nd. It was a high tide. And we'd been swimming all day in Langland, and now we went over to the seafront to go off the sea wall. This was always epic. And in those days, many hundreds would gather from Southend all the way along the coast, front of Oystermouth Station, West Cross all the way, and the sea was up. And it was one of those glorious summer evenings. And I remember we were standing on the wall there. We knew now that things were afoot in Europe. Soldiers had appeared in Mumbles now from nowhere, or regulars, you know, territorials had disappeared, been called up. A lot of excitement and tension there. And that particular night, the tide was very high on the wall, and it was a sort of oily swell just slowly moving, and we were all waiting to go in to the water. And then we were diving off the seawall, etc., and there was a cry. It was just beginning to get darkened down now, and there was a cry from John Hines, and he said, "Look at the Mumbles train." And we turned around. It was coming into the station, into the gloom. The dusk was falling, no lights, all painted blue. And then as he came past, the driver was Mr. Phillips from Gloucester Place. And he always used to wear their ribbons on the uniform, the bus conductors and train conductors. I did a stupid thing. It's a story of my life. I was always doing a stupid thing. And I dived off the sea wall about a week before, and I caught my foot in a little pothole and split the sole of my foot. And my friends carried me very heroically down the road to the British Legion hut, which used to be in the square, in Oystermouth Square, at the back of Boots. And this was a first aid centre, and they'd opened up a new first aid centre, and all the ladies were there, and of course they fell on me. At last there was someone to look after, you see, and they strapped up my foot. I had about 8 nurses round me, you see, and my pouring blood, you know, and they got an ambulance to take me home, you see. And there was the usual reaction when my mother came to the door of the Vic. The ambulance was there, you see. Oh my God, what's happened to you? What's happened to you? You see? And then when she discovered that there was nothing wrong, she thumped me, the sort of thing. Get up the bloody stairs, Soldiers appearing in Mumbles, all the air raid ARP people were calling for recruits. And it was very difficult to get in because we wanted to be messengers. At our age, we were allowed to be messengers at 14, and that was my age. And the headquarters was the British Legion, in where it is now, Marine Villa. And we went along there, but they didn't want us. They said, oh no, we've got all we want. And there was a social thing here. It was all the people who were from Langland. And you see, in Mumbles, is in two quite distinctive parts in those days. You've got South End, the original part of Mumbles, which was having pretty lean time in those days. And you come into the village, and as you come up Duns Lane, you've got Park Street and Gloucester Place and Woodville Road. And these are all more or less on a social level. And then it begins to go up to Oakland Road, where you've got the school teachers. Then Kings Road, the bank managers. And then when you come up the top to Kandala Terrace, as it was called, Langland Road, these are like gods, these were untouchables, And there were boys there you never saw except in the holidays away in boarding school. See, this sort of stuff. Now, all these plum little jobs had gone to these people, and there was nothing at all. And I think the NFS were looking for messengers, and this was not quite so socially acceptable, so you could have gone into that lot. Which is why in 1940, when the Home Guard was formed, we wanted to do something. They took us, no problem, you see. Then on the Sunday morning of September the 3rd, we were all gathered in the dining room in the Vic, which was upstairs, and a number of neighbours who didn't have wireless sets, because not everybody had wireless sets, they were all gathered there. And about 11 o'clock, it was a gorgeous morning, and you could look across the bay from the window there, the sun, and I wanted to get down into the water again. And this glorious morning, and then we heard Chamberlain say that this country, a state of war exists between us and Germany. And so we shot out all the boys, and we went down the village, and we walked out towards the Tut to see what was going on. And this is where all the activity was, and the trucks were coming. There were no signs of any guns being up, but a hell of a lot of personnel was arriving. The Navy were taking over at the Coast Guard. And then it snowballed up remarkably quickly. And then the YMCA in Mumbles was opened, and that was where Ostrom is now. The YMCA took that over, and that became a place for the troops to go, and Mumbles filled up and filled up. And the first people to come were the Greasy Gunners. That's what they called themselves, the Greasy Gunners. They were the first soldiers to come in force. Not so many sailors. They seemed to be confined to Swansea, where their minesweepers were, etc. And a few were down at the, a couple of Scottish lads were down at the Tut. And air raid shelters had been delivered months before. They were already being put up, and nobody would never need them. Don't need those. Waste of time, And of course that was an understatement, if anything. And that was more or less the beginning. See. The memorial I'm referring to is the one in the grounds of All Saints. And for some time now, people have been talking about getting it refurbished because it's been badly weathered, and now the names are barely definable. And I got fed up with this, and I thought, better do something about it. So I saw the vicar, and I said, look, come on, let's get cracking, for God's sake, and do this. I said, not now, but within a year. And I said, we can't squeeze people anymore for money. They've been giving money to the Sun Army, to the church. They said, we've got to try and raise it from some organisation. And so he gave me permission to go ahead. And then we found with horror that you can't do it just like that in the church. It's got to go up before a council. And so we're on hold at the moment. But in the meantime, I'm writing round to find out where the British Legion is the first contact. And then I got hold of somebody to give an estimate, one of the stonemasons, and it's quite a lot actually. I was thinking in terms of a few £1,000, but it's nearer 15, 16, because he said you either have a patch-up job, like just put the names back on, or he said do the lot properly. And I said, okay, we do the lot properly. And it means a new base, everything. And he said, in materials that will not weather. You know. And so Mike Isaacs it is, and he's done a lot of work for the church. So he gave me this rough estimate, and now it's really on hold, but I am going to start making inquiries. And Tony Coburn, you know, in the local council, he's promised to give some help. And if he's as active as he is vociferous, we'll have a lot of help there. We'll wait and see. The one perhaps that had the biggest impact on me was leading seaman Hunt, AP Hunt. Alec was a Park Street boy, and he was a regular RN boy. And he'd come back from South China Sea station, wherever that was, and he had a long, long leave, because in those days, I mean, they weren't flying home every 5 minutes, you know, they were out for a long spell of about 5 years, and he came back and spent nearly every night in the Vic with all the crowd. He had a wonderful time, and this was now about, I think about January, I think it was, 1914. And then he had a wonderful time, and then he wrote his name on the wall one last night, leading seaman AP Hunt RN. I never saw him do it, but the following morning I saw the chalk on the picture, just by the dartboard. And he went back, and he was a delightful lad. He made the place hum, you know. And he was singing. He's standing on the table on his last night singing like this, you see. And he went back and he joined HMS Hardy, and of course it's history now. Within weeks, HMS Hardy was in action in Narvik Fjord, and we heard all about the action, and it was, it had hell out of it, and there were 14 killed, I believe, and including the captain, and sadly, Alec Hunt was one. And he was the first, he wasn't the first Mumbles one, but he's the first one I knew of. And I do believe that a number of merchant seamen were killed before him, and a soldier. But to me, he was the first one who made an impact, and this was for real, you know. And we were shattered, you know, because this was the beginning of the war. We, you know, you don't think that anybody's going to get hurt. War is a glorious thing, you know. And you think that you're going to come back in one piece. Well, anyway, and the sort of reflected glory on him was that the captain got the Victoria Cross, Warburton Lead. I think it was either the first VC of the war or the first naval VC. And that was the first one I knew reasonably well. And then we had a merchant seaman called Tommy Cottle, who was a great character. He went, and then they started coming relatively thick and fast, you know. There's hardly a week went by that somebody wasn't involved. And then my closest friend, Bryn Balston, he joined the Navy in 1937. There was no future at all down here, and a lot of the lads went into the forces. Considerable number of them, the RAF, one or two in the Army, not many in the Army. The RAF had the appeal because it gives them an apprenticeship. Well, anyway, Bryn joined the Navy, and his first ship was Repulse. And he sailed on Repulse to the Far East, and he joined the Prince of Wales, which was a newer ship. And these two were in action then in the South China Seas. And of course, Repulse was sunk, and Prince of Wales. And recently, they have released the Japanese films of it from their angle, you know. And I did Bryn's story, and it took a long time to write it. And sadly, he moved back to Mumbles and died within a few weeks of coming back, and I was looking forward to having time with him. But he was missing for quite a short period, and then sort of the Mumbles spirit came into it when the news came over. His father was working in the dockyard up in Swansea. He came home, he'd heard the news on the wireless lunchtime that Repulse had been sunk with the Prince of Wales. And Bryn's mother and sister were having lunch when they heard it, and they were shattered, and the father came home. And within minutes, Harry Libby was knocking on the door. And this was typical of Harry Libby, a local politician, businessman, etc. And he said, now come on now, you're burying them before you've heard anything at all, the words I paraphrase now. And he said, every Mumbles boy can swim. Every Mumbles boy can swim, and you know how to swim with your son, which was true, because he used to swim with my mother out to the old nets. The nets are gone now, but if you consider that if you swam from the bowling green steps out to the nets, and they were sticking above the water. There's still the remains are there now if you want to walk out. And you go up there and you swim and you look across and you're past West Cross, you're nearly at Black Pill. You've swum anything up to a couple of miles. And you used to swim out against the tide and come in with the tide, you see. And Bryn always said that he used to swim with my mother. I wasn't allowed out, I was too small. And he said that it was that swimming that saved his life, because when the repulse was going down, it suddenly went. It was hit 6 times, bang, 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 bang. And as it keeled over, Bryn thought, I will not go the other side with the boat, so I'll slide down the side of the hull. And the surprise was the amount of weed. And as he came down on the side, he put his life jacket on and it fell apart. His neglect, it had rotted. He had no life jacket, and all he had on was a pair of shorts. And he slipped into the water, and he said he remembers seeing a jet of oil going about 200 feet in the air and falling back, and this was falling on him. And he slipped into the water, how warm it was. And then he thought of sharks. He had no knowledge. And he looked in the distance, and there was the destroyer escort in the distance. And he said, well, there's only one thing for it, to swim. And another boy came up and shouted across him, can I swim with you, Taff? And they swam together, and they swam, and they swam, and they swam. And he says, an estimated 7 miles. And a boat had been put out from the destroyer. In spite of them being attacked, they put out these boats. And when they saw these two swimming, they were full. They said, you'll have to make it on your own, lads. And they swam, and they swam. And they made a destroyer, Vampire. And they were picked up. And he said, it wasn't like on films. We were supposed to have blankets, cigarettes, and hot cocoa. But we were told to get out of the effing way because they were under attack, and they were bundled away into the corner, you see. And he said, and eventually, they went around and around and around, picking up all they could, and then they eventually made Singapore. And then about a week later, they had the telegram that he was okay. And Harry Libby had instructed the postmistress, all telegrams I see first. I don't care what you say, I'm opening them. He said, you're not going to deliver a telegram to anybody around here just like that. And he opened up the telegram, and the Admiralty were pleased to inform you that your son, and he took it up the road. And he said, Mrs. Balston told Bryn afterwards, and he said, he knocked and I waited for him, he had the telegram, and he said straight away, I told you all Mumbles boys can swim. And that's what Harry Libby did. And he sent the letter out, every month was sent out. He'd print letters which people with relatives in the forces, I've got some upstairs now, would collect and mail out with all the local news. And then every week they had one town in Britain was centred on, concentrated on by the BBC to send a message abroad. And they did Mumbles. And sadly, a girl was, they had a few sweethearts to talk, and one little voice piped up, a girl from Blackpill, I forget her name, and she said, hello Warnock, this is so-and-so here, I miss you very much, I love you, come home safely. And he was in the Merchant Navy, and he was 17 at the time, and he was lost on the journey coming back, and he was one of the youngest killed from Mumbles, Warnock Hunt, no relation to Alec Hunt. And his father was a master at sea, Joe Hunt, Captain Hunt, who used to be the lighthouse keeper. And he went back to sea, made up straight away with 4 rings and the braid. Joe was on the Mill Hill in, I think it was in Montreal, I'm not sure, he was over the other side. And he was due to come back with the ship, and a cable broke. hit him and broke his ribs, and he was hospitalised. And the Mill Hill was lost on the way home. With it was Tommy Cottle, one of the Mumbles boy. And everybody said it's the luck of the Irish, but it wasn't. He lost his son. His other son was burnt to death. So, the luck of the Irish had run out for poor old Joe. And lovely man. And he came back, and one of the great crabbers and lobsterers of Mumbles off the lighthouse, And I used to go out with him when he was on leave and pick up a few. Only once or twice on a regular thing. But again and again, the names were coming in, and then it became people I knew better, nearer to my age, like Pussy, Gordon Pusey, he was killed in the RAF, and these were the good lads who were going now, very good lads. They were members of the 3rd Scouts. I was in the 1st Scouts, which were the Poor Relations, and the 3rd Scouts were the Lanarkshire, and these were the boys all became pilots and flyers, and of course we lost a hell of a lot of those, Sussex Regiment, they came to Mumbles 1940-41. The Royal Sussex were a regular unit. They were made up, the bulk of the battalion were regular soldiers, time-serving men, and most of them had a General Service Medal, and they'd served in India or Palestine and places like that. And they came to Mumbles, and the difference between them and the gunners was the gunners were with khaki blanco, and these boys wore white. Their stripes were white, and they wore a Probus pea green blanco was on their equipment. I mean, it was a quite a distinctive colour, and they really were a good unit. And the colonel was a chap called Barker, Evelyn Barker, and he became a general, and he was knighted, Sir Evelyn Barker, and I think he became a big wheel. I think he was a governor of one of the out in the Bahamas or something, I'm not sure, but they were very, very good, and they were here for about 6 months, I think it was, a fining off. They were being trained, ready to go abroad, and Alec had put his name on the wall, in a pub, and all groups of soldiers would adopt pubs, and they'd stay with them. And they'd get to know the locals there. They'd come and have a bath in your house. They would have meals with you, etc., etc. And of course, in the Vic, this was the way it was. The regulars all came night after night, and one of them was Corporal Legg. And on eve of departure, he wrote his name underneath Alex. And but within about 3 months, it was heard that he'd been killed in action in North Africa. They joined what was the forerunner of the 8th Army. I think it was probably not long after General Wavell had taken over. And Corporal Legg was killed. And of course, they put it out then, if you put your name on the wall, that you would die. And the sequel to that was, nobody did, except one night, Captain Jack Williams, who died a few years ago in the Glenvivian Home for the Blind, a great local character. He lived in Park Street, and he came in one night, and he was getting cold feet. Now he's on the Atlantic crossings, going back and forth. It was a lovely story because he'd been a cadet in the merchant service many years ago, and he'd been laid off. They'd all been laid off because there was no work, and he became a bus conductor. And war broke out, and he immediately went back into the merchant navy, and he wanted to build on what he had, and he was 3rd officer, 2nd officer, and in no time at all he had his own ship, and he was doing the Atlantic crossing. And on one trip home, he had this beautiful greatcoat on with his 4 rings, and I said, my God, that's all right. He said, yes, I had it made in Halifax, and then he came home on another leave, and he said, the odds were now getting shorter all the time because the tonnage we were losing was incredible at that time. And he came in this last night, and I was there when he walked in, and he was out of his skull. He could hardly stand. And he came in, and he was shouting good night to everybody. It was about 10 o'clock, and he got a piece of chalk from the dartboard, and he wrote his name on the wall, Captain Jack Williams, Empire Cheetah. Something like that. And he put the chalk down the wall like that. And he said, and here's one bugger that's coming back. Well, he went out into the night. And that night then, The pub closed, upstairs, it was about 10:30. Doorbell. I went to the window, look out, and said to my father, Frida Williams, Jack's wife, can she come in and take Jack's name off the wall? Yeah, go on down. She went down, and she went into the bar, but she had a little pail, and she washed the wall down. She was crying. She said, why did he do this? Why did he do this? You know, and I said, oh, it's only a superstition, Frida, you know. And she went off, and Jack went back, and a fortnight later, we heard he'd been torpedoed, lost his ship, very heavy losses, and he was picked up. And weeks later, before he got home, and he came home, and he always said it, he said, he said, Frida, if you hadn't washed my name off that wall, I'd have bloody had it. Well, what happened, you see, I told you we couldn't get into the ARP and what have you, and then Anthony Eden made his famous speech and called for the formation of the LDV, Local Defence Volunteers, and it overwhelmed everybody. And the first thing I saw was in 24 hours after the formation of the Home Guard, there was a man walking along the Mumbles Road by the bowling green with a steel helmet and an armband and a rifle. And that was his uniform, LDV, already. And the situation was so acute that they expected any minute for airborne troops we thought were going to land. They were across the water. Dunkirk was over. The Battle of Britain was still being fought, really. But Dunkirk was over, and now Hitler, after the speed with which he came through Holland and Belgium and France, was unbelievable. This was the origin of the word blitz, the blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It come through. And we, of course, you know, people who had knowledge would realize, of course, you've got to build up a tremendous force before they could come across barges and God knows what, because an airborne invasion is always a disaster. It's only a forerunner. Every airborne invasion of the war was a complete disaster, starting with Crete. And there was no way they could invade this kind of, but everybody thought now the sky's going to be black with paratroopers, and they're all going to be dressed as nuns. Everybody going to be disguised as nuns. You see, we're going to have, it's going to be like the Sound of Music, you know, nuns everywhere. And immediately, right, even the police were walking around with steel helmets with police on and carrying rifles. And God knows where they got them all from, but they did get enough rifles to go around. And then the Mumbles Home Guard, the first thing that happened was Major Davis was called upon as being an ex-field ranking officer to form them. And he got in touch with Bert Palmer, who was an estate agent, and these were all ex-warriors from World War I. And I remember Bert Palmer saying years later, you know, a meeting was called inviting everybody from Mumbles to come to the Underhill Park. And he said, I had vague memories in my mind of how you form fours, because that was abandoned in the 30s when they marched in threes, columns of three. But he was trying to remember how to march people in fours. And they all came up there. And a lot of jobs fell automatically to the right people. The postman was a Mr. Mitchell, a cadaverous-looking gentleman who'd been a regular soldier all his life, come out, settled in Mumbles, and he automatically became the company sergeant major, and he was a very good one too, very professional, World War I. And then all the officers turned up from Langland and Caswell, where else? The rank and file turned up from the village, where else, you see? And ranks were given out all over the place. And then after a week or two, we found that people who had their own businesses, like the butchers, Sergeant Rees, who was in Clem Thomas, took his shop over in Newton Road, George Rees the butcher. Next to him, Walter O'Neill, who had the Wilder shop, signal sergeant automatically. Across the road, Cliff Rosser the butcher. And anyway, they all came and ranks were given out and formed into various companies. And so after a few weeks, my friend Peter Hooper, who was studying to be an accountant, articled accountant, he said, I'm going to join the Home Guard. the LDV. And he was just a little bit older than I was, and I said to my mother and father, I now was 15. And we got together, Peter Smith, who was still alive and living down in the chalets in Caswell, myself, Duncan Bishop, Hubert Davis, who went down on a Saturday afternoon, and there was a gentleman in the Tivoli Cinema, in the Regent Cinema, which is now the Arcade, and this was open, and we went in, and the first thing I remember was the sloping floor, and there was the old screen, and on the right were a little group of men around a machine gun, which I didn't recognize what it was, but it turned out it was a Lewis gun. And in the other corner were a group of men around a Vickers gun. And we went up to the table there, and Captain Howard was sitting there, and he worked in the Guildhall. Now I recognised Pipsqueak and Wilfred from World War I, but the others I didn't recognise, and they were Boer War ribbons, you see, and there he was with his white hair, already now beginning to feel his rank, and he didn't have pips. He called himself Captain Howard from World War I, but he had a black bar across, and he's in denims, and he had a Sam Brown, which is a very rare combination, Sam Brown with denim, but he was there. And he put these forms down, and I said, can we join? And he said, if you're old enough, yes. And he said, you're 17? Oh, yes, we're 17. And we're all about 15, and we filled all these in. And we signed them. I remember one of our lot had great difficulty writing. It was rather sad, and he looked at him, you know, and to put him at ease, he said, have you been to bloody school, boy? I don't remember that, but anyway, by the way, and that was it. And then we turned up then on the following Tuesday evening, and because we were from a certain part of Mumbles, we went into number 1 platoon, which was commanded by a chap called Chown, who lived on the top of Overland Road, Bircham. And he was a sniper in World War I, and in his house he had a telegram framed on the wall. He had a telegram sent to him by name that the war had finished, because he was a unit on his own, and he had this framed. Telegrams usually went to units at battalion level, but he had one sent to him, you know, to try to stop him shooting Germans after November the 11th, you see. And he had this platoon. And then Sergeant Bishop, who was a Passchendaele, survivor of Passchendaele, and there were 4 sections and corporals, and my section was commanded by Corporal Jeffers, who was from the Coast Guards, known as Plum. He was rather large and a very nice chap, Plum, and his second in command was a Lance Corporal. So we had now this didn't conform to normal regular army proportions, as it were. Like you used to find probably 3 sections to a platoon, and here we now had 4 or even 5, because in order to keep you living in an area, they'd have number 1 platoon would be perhaps about 40, 50 instead of 30, and that came from the heart of Oystermouth. Then you'd have the Norton boys and the South End boys in various ones, you see. And it sorted itself out, and all the World War I officers had regained their ranks, and then Major Davis was in command. Bert Palmer was second in command. The adjutant was Mr. Benjamin Walker-Jones, a solicitor. And I was seeing people I never knew existed, you know, as a village boy. You know, these people had come down from the hills, you know, down to take over. And all talked in a slightly different way to the these and thous of the village. But in my platoon, I remember people like George Turnbull. He was in the Hussars, and this man had served in the Boer War, he served in the Great War, and he was a signaller. And here he was again. After 2 wars, here he was again, and he knew the score. He knew what it was all about. He knew the score, that the situation was that a colossal army, probably one of the most efficient armies in the history of warfare, was assembling on the other side of the Bristol Channel, of the English Channel, and that one day they were going to come across very soon. And he knew that there wasn't a hope in hell of this body of men doing anything other than being able maybe to check them long enough for the regular forces to get there. And they all knew. We didn't. It was a lark. The whole thing was a lark. We were wet behind the ears. We were stupid youngsters. And we were going along there, something to do, and we wanted to be involved. But they knew, and yet they went again. And all of them, old men, 60s, 70s, and I suspect 80s as well, fully aware what was going on, and they went there. And there was a counterpart for every one of these men in Dad's army that you saw. This was a wonderfully researched program, and yet there was an intensity about it for that short period of time, up to about the spring of 41. This particular group of Home Guard, they were very intense about it, and there was very serious undertones to it, no question of it, and especially for those lads who were involved along the south coast. And anyway, it took a fair while to get the organisation, and we were in just when they changed the LDV bands to Home Guard. We still had denims. They weren't enough to go around, but we got a top, and then we got the boots, and then greatcoats came in. And the thing that impressed me most was that the rifles we had in the Mumbles Home Guard were different to the rest of the country. They were all given Ross, Canadian Ross rifles from the Boer War period, which were 300, and we had Lee Enfields 303. And this lent itself to our prestige. And when we entered drill competitions, we won them all for two reasons. One, we had Lee Enfield rifles. One, we were the best. And thirdly, we had recruited a sergeant called Jack Anderson. And he and his brothers lived in Marine Villa. And Jack Anderson had a brother, Mike, who was a policeman. And Ralph, who'd been wounded at Dunkirk, had a very bad scar on his face. He was a Coldstream Guardsman. Jack had been a Welsh Guardsman, and he'd been a company sergeant major in the Welsh Guardsman. Now he'd come into the Mumbles Home Guard, and he became the drill sergeant. And he took this small squad into all the competitions. And of course, I was a member of that squad. And there's one surviving member in Mumbles now, Tommy Lewis, who used to stand about 3 inches taller than I did. And now he's 3 inches shorter. And Tommy was called up for the Welsh Guards himself, and he served, I think it was in France, I'm not sure. But he's still around Mumbles now, a delightful chap, Tommy. The obvious thing to do was to put them into positions where they could release the regular forces. And this is where the younger element in the Home Guard came more into their own. And I found that what it gave me, the Home Guard, was apart from this breakdown in the social barriers in Mumbles. I was now talking to people who'd never deigned to see me, you know, but you'd find yourself on guard at night in Black Pill, and there'd be a number of the Langland crowd, and this was a time in Mumbles when there was a closest integration, and we all got on very, very well. But the greatest contribution to me was what I learned from the old school. I learned drill to guard standard from Jack Anderson. I learned how to bone my boots so that they were like glass. I had a uniform now tailored to fit, to try to look the part. And I learned, I was sent on a course to Liverpool for a fortnight to the Altcar Rifle Ranges, regular army school, and he went in with the regular soldiers in a fortnight course on small arms, and Western Command Weapon Training School at Altcar. And it was a wonderful course, and I learned that we didn't have Bren guns, we had Lewis guns. I learned the Lewis gun, I learned all about the latest grenades, I learned the Tommy gun, and I learned the Sten gun, and all these we learned. I came back, I'd made up to corporal, and I was beginning to think I really was beginning to know it all. If you look at Blackpill Station, you've still got the camouflage on it. You've seen it, still painted there, the camouflage of Blackpill. And in front of it there was a minefield, which everybody said were dummy mines. And then one day in the middle of the day, there was a hell of an explosion all across Swansea. And when we came back in the Mumbles train, there was this great big crater, and a dog had got through the wire and gone in onto the field, and it was blown to smithereens, and it made everybody realise you don't go the other side. But we used to go, the church hall at Blackpill. Now that was, and at the back was where we kept all the ammunition and blacker bomb bars, and weapons we kept there. And then behind that was the club in capitals, the club. That was the church club, a social club, and we used to go on guard at Blackpill at 9 o'clock every night. A picket would go up, and it'd come up about once every 3 weeks. Now, this was difficult for me because I was in school, I was in grammar school, you see, and there was no getting out of it. You had to do your turn. So we got up at 9 o'clock. And they were very good, the picket, because the sergeant would say, right, as you're a lad, you go on first at 9 o'clock now, and two of you go on together. And I used to go on with Alec Cosman and do 2 hours together. So we'd go on at 9 and come back in at 11. Now that meant the whole picket could go down to the woodman, and they'd all disappear. The whole bloody lot of them go down to the woodman, 9 o'clock, and come back at 10 o'clock when it closed. And Alec and I would have 1 more hour, and then we'd come in, you see. And anyway, then we go to bed, because you get a night's sleep. And then 6 o'clock in the morning, we knocked off, and we catch the Mumbles, the first train back at Blackpill, come home, wash, change, breakfast, and go to school. But it wasn't too bad, you know. And we learned what it was like to do a picket, etc., etc. And there were never any incidents. Now, prior to the guard room being there, it used to be at the bottom of the mails. Now, there was a row of houses which extended from Lloyd's garage to the bottom of the mails, a little row of houses which had now been knocked down. Now, the end one was taken over, and upstairs the area wardens, and downstairs the Home Guard had their gear there, and they used to do a patrol on the shore in case odd nuns were being dropped, you know, something. And anyway, they'd come back in, and they had to do this patrol. All sentry duty on the front there was with rifles fully loaded, but not one up the spout, of course. And they come back in, and there's a drill you go through. You're probably familiar with it, where you clear your throat, you see, and then pull the trigger. And of course, this particular night, Mr. Thatcher was on, Lieutenant Thatcher, and he was in charge of the labour exchange on a World War I officer. And he was there, and he gives a command clear. And of course, some clown didn't do it enough time and pulled the trigger, and a bullet went up through the ceiling, you know, and it upset the wardens rather. They were very cross about it. I don't think anybody was hurt, but it gave them rather a shock when this round from a Lee Enfield rifle suddenly came through the floor, and they wanted it to be stopped forthwith. And we were moved then, and then we went down to the top. And then prior to that, one night there was a stick of bombs were dropped across the bay. There was a wreck in the bay, being towed in, mine ship. There were several of them in the bay, and one was there. And rumours were that somebody thought it was the Ark Royal or something, all sorts of reasons. I don't know how the hell they found that out. And this aircraft had come in and dropped a stick of bomb. And this wretched fellow was on sentry duty in the first guard room at the bottom of the mails, and he was standing there ready to lay down his life for his country. And then suddenly he heard this whistling noise, and he realised what it was. And I mean, if you've ever been under a bomb, you really do think it's coming to you. You really do. And this thing was coming over, and of course he took off. He did what any wise man would do, and he took off. And he ran so fast, he hit one of the pumps on the Lloyd's petrol station. He hit it and broke his shoulder. And the impetus was such that he was after him before he fell to the ground, you know. They called us out one night. We only ever called out, I think, 3 times. And once was when the bells rang. Once when the bells didn't ring. And there was a scare, or there was going to be a landing or something. And on this particular night, we had a call-out system, which was very effective, you know, with a backup. One man had to call somebody else. but if he didn't turn up, there was a backup call to make sure that somebody else came. And we were called out this particular night. We went down to the Regent Cinema, and what's going on? And Captain Hayes was there, whose wife ran the wool shop in Newton Road. He was there, and he said, they're having a bit of trouble up the Mumbles Hill. Something or other's going on. We don't know what it is, whether it's been a spontaneous fire amongst themselves, but they want all the help they can get. And so, any volunteers? Oh, yeah, we'll go. And I remember who came with me, Peter Hooper and Frank Martin. Said, three go off now, and another three will follow. And so we ran off. You don't need any gear, take your helmets and great coats, and off we went. It was about 10-ish, something like that. And when we reached Oystermouth Station, we could see the glow. And so we started running along the line now. And then before we came to the old lifeboat house, we saw these incendiary bombs all along the railway line. And of course, we started picking these up because these were great souvenirs. And some of them were complete with the fig, often lost the fins. And we stuffed these in, and I had about three or four. And Frank picked up some, and so did Peter. Then we went up the steps, and now as we were coming up now, we could hear it now, and we could see the sparks flying up. And we ran around, and that's when all the vehicles were building up now, and there's a lot of activity. The AFS, what was the Auxiliary Fire Service, which became the NFS, they were there. And anyway, we came out, and then we were told to report to someone, and there was an NCO. They'd given out, he had a big diesel drum full of water, giving us these sacks. And we ran up. But there was no risk involved or anything at all. It was just exciting. We were beating and beating and beating. We were and unfortunately, there was a breeze. And if you left the sparks behind, they'd come up again, you see. And in my mind and imagination, I was explaining this to my friends the next day, we were surrounded by a sea of flame in front and behind, which wasn't so, of course, you see, but you've got to lay it on a bit, haven't you, And we were beating out these flames, and this was the first time I'd been involved. It was a real team effort, and there were hundreds of soldiers all beating them up all the way up, And the worry was an obvious one, because here was right on the side of the Mumbles Hill, facing out down, there was a beacon burning, and a wonderful, wonderful navigation laid. I think possibly in retrospect that they knew where they were without any aids like that. It's very rarely that these airmen got lost, but there was this thing. But and of course they're probably fully aware about the batteries and the position and relative to it, and they could have pinpointed it, But we told the people of Mumbles that without any doubt at all that we'd saved their lives, that Frank Martin. And you know about the sequel to it, the sequel to this was we came home, and as we were walking down through the village now, it was about 2 in the morning, we were a little bit weird, beginning to catch up on us now. And as we passed the Pilot, the blackout curtain parted, and Reggie Hunt stuck his head out, the brother of Alec who was killed. And he said, "Everything all right now?" And I said, "Oh yes, Reg, touch and go, Reg, touch and go." And I said, and he said, "Come in, boys." And we went in, the place was packed. It was about 2 in the morning, they're all there with their pints, you see. And we took our helmet off. And there was when I looked at Frank, he was black, you see, in the white mark. And I didn't realise, how black it was. And all down the front of my coat was thermite from one of the bombs, or fine grey dust of magnesium powder. And I realised now, of course, that would have gone like that, you see. Not necessarily dangerous, because you shrug off the coat quickly. But that's when I lost one of the bombs. One of them I handed over as a souvenir when I saw them sticking out of my pocket. And then went home, a bed, and then following day now I started scraping. These fins were aluminium covered with what is a lovely Luftwaffe green. It's an odd shade of grey-green, and their aircraft camouflage was similar. And I scraped all this off to get down to the aluminium, polished it up, stuck it on, and I put a little label. This bomb was picked up by Private Grafton Maggs of the Mumbles Home Guard on the date. And I put it up on the mantel as a fixture, old-fashioned mahogany fixture with a mirror, and I put it on the top there, you see, above the coal fire. And there it was, you see. And I showed it to my father, and he said, well done, well done. And I put didn't know about the other one, I put the other one in the back of the drawer on the sideboard. And following afternoon, there's a shout from down the stairs, Graf, come down here, get yourself down here. So I went downstairs. And there was Sergeant Martin, the policeman, and Frank, his son, had been with me. He said, have you got an incendiary bomb upstairs? I said, yes. He said, bring it down here now at once. So I brought it down, and he unscrewed it, and the spring jumped out, and a spiral of aluminium, and he said, look, Lynn, see that copper cap there with a cross on it? That's a detonator. And Frank, his son, leaned over and he said, if you put a screwdriver on that, it goes round. And Frank, he said, what can you bloody do with them, Glyn? What can you do? My father, he said. And my father, I said, wait, what did you say? He said, it's live bomb. I said, you've got a live bomb upstairs on the mantelpiece above the fire. And he said, and Sergeant Martin said, he said, you're a bloody idiot, aren't you? And I said, yes. And he said, don't you ever do anything like that again. My father was speechless, you see, and he took the bomb away. I had it back the next day. He'd defused it, emptied all the thermite out, and I got it back. And my father, he was puce. I've never seen, he was in a hell of a sweat. And he played hell with me. And, he said, I thought you were having a decent education and a bit of common sense, he said, but he said, I've brought a bloody lunatic in the world, And what he never found out about the other one, I had that in the drawer, and that went to America. I told you about that with Joe Hunt, I get no relation to Alec, the one who had the captain, and he took it across to America, and it was auctioned in he had it defused, and it was auctioned in a Red Cross thing for British Red Cross, sold for $1,000 or so, and money for the front, But no, I think really that I had a number of things going for me, and all those like me, there's nothing unusual at all in that the Home Guard gave me and all the others who were in it, the youngsters, a working knowledge of the army. We knew enough of ranks, we knew enough of weapons, and this is what we were very thankful for. We were keen, we were enthusiastic. Most people had air raid shelters in the garden, which they thought they'd never use, and then gradually, when of course the bombing came for real, and there were 5 bad nights in Swansea, 2 separate ones, and then followed by the 3-night Blitz in '41, and all the time, though, you see, the sirens were going. But it got to the stage that between these big ones, you stay in bed. In Mumbles, you would. I mean, in Swansea, of course, it'd be foolish to do that. But down here in Mumbles, we tended the sirens go, not to bother. And one night, there was a bit of a fright. My mother didn't hear it, but I was in bed one night, and I woke up, and at breakfast the next morning, I said, did a bomb come over the house last night? I said, no, nothing at all, you must have dreamt it. And I woke up and I heard that an explosion. And it had come over the house and it had dropped on the cliff path. Now, on the Mumbles train the next morning going to school, Graham Allen, who was a police sergeant's son in Newton, said, what do you think of the bomb last night? I said, there was a bomb. Yes, he said, came over our house. No, it came over our house. No, it came over our house. And it went across, coming from apparently from the direction of the bay, across the Mumbles Peninsula, and it dropped down and it hit, it came down at an arc like that, of course, not like that, just like that. And it came down and it landed on the cliff path about 40 yards up from the esplanade in Langland on the cliff path going towards Limeslade. And when we got off the Mumbles train, we all went straight over to Lang, and there it was. And it was still smoking, this great, and you could still see the shape. If you go up the path, you'll see on the left-hand side a very nice semicircle cut out, now all overgrown. But that's where it landed. We went up to see it, you know. But in Mumbles, we were very, very fortunate indeed, and everybody had a grandstand view of the bay. And of course, lots and lots of people crammed into Mumbles, given temporary accommodation down here and what have you, to get away from the Swansea bombing. And I mean, they really had a hell of a beating there. And the thing was too, you see, night after night, it's not so much the bomb, but you lose your sleep. And men had to go in and do a day's work, kids had to go to school, and you'd be down the air raid shelter. And everybody they never knew, was it going to be another big one, you see. Every time they flew, of course, the warning would go. And you used to hear them, the sirens. The sirens would start off, you'd be in bed, and then you just hear a very, very faint one, then another one, then another one, then another, all building up. And there was one down opposite the Marine, you know, on the President. There was one in Newton, and at first we could only barely hear one from Black Pill, and then gradually they all built up, you know, and then of course you couldn't mistake the ones in Mumbles then would go off, you know. On the night of the first Blitz, it was obviously this was going to be a bad night, and we were called down to the, either called down or there was a parade on the I think it was a Monday night, and a call came that they needed some help. Would volunteers go up to Swansea? And of course, you know, it was like when later on when it's a lark, you know, you're totally unaware of any danger. And this time it was Kenny Bale and Freddie Evans from Gower Place. We walked up, and of course when we reached Bryn Mill, now you could see really that this was something now. You could feel the concussion coming through from the town as it was going up, you see. And we went up past the Brangwyn, by the Brangwyn Hall, and we came up now to Hospital Square, and we were stopped now, and there was a senior warden in charge, and he said, you don't go any further than this. They've got all they can do to handle the middle of town. You haven't got to go, you don't go up there, you'll be in the way. It's congested, they're trying to get the ambulances in and out this, that and the other. So we want you here. So I said, okay, tell us what to do. And he said, well, you know how to put an incendiary bomb out? And I said, yes, we've been taught all that. Okay. And we were now by Hospital Square with the old hospital, and there used to be a police box on the corner there, you remember? Lloyd's Bank opposite, and I think where T.W. Thomas used to be on the corner. And just then, we just arrived, and we were in the square, and we heard this, you know, and he said, down. We went down, and it landed where the present T.W. Thomas is, just over the other side. This bomb went down. And it seemed to be in the sky. It was my impression. This explosion was in the sky, a great big glow. And then following that, then all the way down Brynham Road was a popping, pop, 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 pop. And these were all incendiaries, all the way down. And the warden was, you know, he's a young man. I don't know who the hell he was, but he said, never mind the ones on the road, get the ones in the shops. And opposite the Westbourne Hotel, there was a corn, that supplied corn and meal for animals and farms, I suppose, I don't know. But there was this shop window, and it was one right down in the middle burning there, you see. So Kenny Bale and I ran across, and I picked up the sandbag and put it on top, you see, and the flames were coming out on the side, and it wasn't supposed to do that, you see. It was supposed to put it out straight away, but these bloody flames were coming. I said, quick, get another sand, put it there, and I had knitted khaki gloves on, and I was beating these all out like that, and then out it went, and the chap who owned the shop came, oh, thank you ever so much, and he shook hands with us like, I thought, right, many time, you know, any time, just let us know. And then there was a come on, there's no time for small talk. And we went down the road, and there were a few more in the shop windows. We dealt with those. And then suddenly, this from Kensington Crescent, this chap came running around quick. He said, we've got one in our loft. Running in, and I always remember downstairs, he weren't in the area chair, there was a cluster of people all round the table, and typical family, grandma, grandpa, and they were all there looking up, charging in, and sort of blind leading the blind, and charging up the stairs, and there was this thing, and it was in there, a little box room at the back, burning there, and what I can remember was the intensity of, in this room, was the intensity of the light. You could hardly look at it, It was just magnesium burning, and put the sandbag on it, and then another one, he went out, and we said, come on, and the boy said, no, he said, he said, you wait with this one, it's indoors, it could be in the floorboards, you got to wait. He really was genned up, and then he took charge of us, and then, that was just, it was nothing like the havoc in town, and I never felt threatened, not for 1 minute, not blind to danger, there just wasn't any, there didn't seem to be any at all. The action in the Blitz was right down in the middle of the town. This is where there's a bloody inferno. When I was in the army, my brother told me the sad story in Philip's Parade up the side of the hospital, an unexploded bomb there. And a few years previously, when I was in the Mumbles Home Guard, a Major Davis, who had a military medal from World War I, he'd been in the ranks, it wasn't a cross, military medal and bar from World War I, was leaning against the table talking about his work in charge of the bomb disposal squad. And they were messed up in Higher Lane, and that was where all these boys were, with the wonderful red rectangle and the golden bomb on it. I mean, this was prestigious to wear that bomb. These were special men. This is what I call courage. And when Di the Gas Williams in Newton was a sergeant in the bomb disposal squad, and he always used to say to me, as well, I could never jump out of an aeroplane. And I say, Di, I said, I hated it, I was always frightened. I said, but I could never even contemplate tackling a bomb. And Major Davis was down in the hole outside Swansea Hospital working, and he'd given us a lecture on his work and all the different types of bombs. He had all the fuses there, and just leaning against the table talking about his team and how they did it and how they learned from every bomb. That man went down the hole with his sergeant on this bomb, and that day he sent his sergeant up. He said, you go, I'll handle this one, you go. And he was talking on the, he used to have the very primitive way, talking, saying, describing everything he was doing, and that day, in the middle of the day, up it went. And my brother, all the kids, rushed down to Hospital Square that lunchtime to see what was going on, and the crowds around there, all the police off, and there was the police box, and one of the boys pointed, and there was the arm, Major Davis's arm, with the bomb was behind the box, right behind the box. And my brother told me about that. And when I got home in the early hours in the morning, my mother played hell. I came up the road to the Vic, walked all the way home, and it was snowing, very light snowfall. And I came in, again, all black, and I knocked on the door of the Vic, and it was about 2 in the morning, and there were people in the bar. Nellie Hoskins was there, Jack Williams, his wife, was there, and they were drinking cider because there was no beer left, everything gone. And I took my helmet off and I put it on the bar counter. And I didn't know my father was in Swansea that night in Hancock's on fire watching duty. Everybody in the war had to take a turn with their firm of going as fire watchers. And they were issued with sandbag, and they'd be on the roof of all these buildings. And Hancock's was the then tallest building in Swansea, the bottling department down in Wine Street and Little Wine Street. And when the siren would go, he and his colleague would go on the roof and any bombs fell, they'd put it out. Well, I didn't know it. Dad was up there. My mother was on her own. My brother Colin was in bed. And I came into the barn, I put my helmet down, and she hit it, flying. And I just walked away. I was so tired. And I went upstairs, and Colin was awake in bed. And he said, Dad's going to bloody murder you when he comes home. He didn't know you'd gone to Swansea. And I said, oh, I was so tired. I had school the next day, you see. And there was school the next school. We went up and we turned back, but the school hadn't been touched until the last night. So the next night, my mother said, you've got to give me your word that you're not going up to Swansea. And Kenny Bale came up. He said, I'm going up again. Are you coming? And I just didn't have the nerve to face my mother and do it, so I didn't go. So I didn't go, and he went on the 3 nights, Ken Bale. And that 2 nights I went down on the square and I was watching. I saw everything from the first sirens and just getting dark, and then we heard the sirens go. And when you were down on the square, you could hear them right over Port Talbot, somewhere up the valley, God knows where, from miles away. You know, they started, and then there was the pause, and you could see all the Mumbles NFS boys, all the engines were out ready to go, everywhere, all geared up, and then you heard it, you heard the throb. And then the first of the searchlights come on, and then you heard in the distance the ack-ack guns go, and they started going like this. And then in it come, and then the first thing were the flares. And the whole bay was lit up like day. A beautiful sight, all these flares coming down, floating down slowly. And then when they'd gone, another batch would appear. And then in would come, and then suddenly you'd see across Town Hill a sparkle of lights go like that all the way across, incendiaries all across, and then they'd go and they'd go, and then you'd see the few remaining ones, and the colour would change to red from the intense white of magnesium would change to red, and then another lot would come out, and another lot, and then in the middle of the town, you go, you see them all coming up, and then the fires would get started. And this is where they were desperately trying to put the fires out. And then you see the red glows of the established fires starting everywhere. And then in the middle of the town. And it coincided, the big fire was coincident with the Swansea Valley dip. That's where the big, and you had a silhouette of cranes of the docks on the side. And the side of the Guild Hall was the lights, with the reflection of the light. And they were working. Now, after the first night, they hadn't been able to extinguish all the fires of the first night. So it was a cumulative thing. The second raid came in, and there were more fires, and then the third one came in. And of course, they just flew straight in. They could see exactly where they were going. And they added to the this inferno in the middle of the town, you know, it was absolutely, and that burnt for days, you know, you could see it. And it went up into the sky, into the clouds, you see. And that was a glow that could be seen from Cardiff and Exeter, all the way around, you know. And the impact, you know, the percussion, you see the explosion and then the time for the sound to reach you, know, across the bay. And every now and then there would be something special, I don't know what it was, and somebody would say that's a landmine. And I remember one going off on the top of town. It was one hell of a clatter when it went. But most of them were the sort of hollow boom, you know, but then this one went off on the top of Town Hill.